just actually going to press record. So we're thrilled to be celebrating 10 years of since Brockholes opened, our 10th birthday, and I actually started working for the trust a couple of years before Brockholes first opened. So I've been in the lucky position to see it grow and the amazing things that we've done there, and it's really great that Lorna's going to be here tonight to talk to us about the wildlife and what we've done and how we've created Brockholes from a quarry. So I'm going to pass over to Lorna. In fact, before I pass over to Lorna, I'm going to launch just a little poll, a quick poll. Is that launched there, guys?
No. Nope.
Let's try again, shall we?
That's it.
Okay, so yeah, we just thought it'd be interesting to see sort of the mix of how well you guys know Brockholes. Oh, still got some answers coming in. Okay. Okay, so we've got a mix. Some people have never been. Quite a decent amount of people have never been. So we'll have to sell it to you tonight. That's your job, Lorna. And lots of regular visitors as well, which is lovely. So thank you everybody for joining us. And I'm going to stop waffling on now and pass over to Lorna.
Okay, welcome everyone. So yeah, we're celebrating 10 years of having been open to the public. And so I'm here to talk to you tonight about the wildlife over the course of that 10 years, offering a bit of insight into several of the sort of key habitats that Brockholes has and how they've perhaps changed over that 10 years. In turn, you know, what wildlife we've got, how that might have changed, what we can see on the site here today, and maybe a little bit of a think about what we might be looking at seeing in the future. I'm going to share a presentation with you, so I'm going to share my screen in a minute. I do recognise you're likely to be a broad audience tonight, so some of you will, as we've seen, never visited before or have recently discovered Brockholes. Some of you will have been with us from the start, which in honesty is more than I have. I've been around as a visitor, but I've been involved closely as staff for the last 5 years. So forgive me if any of my early years knowledge is a little sketchy, but I've certainly understood how it's shaped where we are today. And again, some of you will be specialists, you know, really knowledgeable about certain groups, for example. Others might just be learning about ID. I'm hoping to pitch this talk kind of in the middle, give you a little bit of insight about, you know, what's there, what opportunities there are to see things, and yeah, what's involved in getting us there, really. So I'm going to share my screen now. Bear with me. And here we go. Okay, can we all see that? Yep. So yeah, by way of introduction, so as we've established, so I'm Lorna, I'm the reserve officer, and this outlined in the red boundary is Brockholes, which was a former quarry. So I'm responsible for the wildlife side of it, as opposed to any visitor engagement, you know, running side of things. It's about 106 hectares, so 250 acres. And it's a real mix of habitats, which is amazing and also challenging in terms of how to look after it. You can see the two big lakes outlined in the blue. On top of that, we have an array of different grasslands, reed beds, woodlands, and other features that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, really. So my role, together with Assistant Reserve Officer Tom, is, yes, to actively implement, you know, management on the habitats, also to sort of budget that, to schedule things, to look at surveying and monitoring and collating information, because we want to see that what we're practically doing on the reserve is influencing things in the right way. many people might assume that you could sort of leave nature to it, and to some extent you can. That's the principle of the rewilding concept. But on a small scale, which this is relatively small scale site, if you're trying to have a nice mosaic of habitats, you do need quite a bit of human input. And particularly because it's come from human disturbance in the first place as this site. So it's come from the quarry, which, as you're going to see, influences, and shapes how the natural succession is going to then evolve from there. So yeah, we have a lot to do, and to help us along the way, we have teams of volunteers who are invaluable when we need many hands on deck, really. And that could be, pond clearance, as in this photo, or an array of things. As you can see, we have large areas of land to manage, and we do have machinery to manage some of it. And some volunteers, will operate that machinery. A lot of the time, though, it is just physical, hand tools and getting stuck in, which is sometimes challenging, but very rewarding, because we can actually see the measured output, which is what we're going to talk about now, really. So where do we start? This is a little after. We're underway. We're starting in this photo. The orientation is different. You can see the motorway in the background there, and you can see that we were working on the visitor village down in the sort of left-hand side of the screen. But the principle is, the quarry had been dug out the sand and gravel deposits that they wanted to sell, and then a degree of reprofiling took place. What was left was the big quarry pits and pools, which are the lakes and ponds that we know today, really. So there are key ones shown in the image there. And with any sort of freshwater, clean freshwater habitat, this colonizes really quickly. So right from the day that they stopped pumping out, really, then the freshwaters in the reserve, well, in the site, the active site at that time, started colonizing. It would be with tiny organisms to start with, planktonic crustacea, Daphnia, and midge larvae, and aquatic beetles and things. But very quickly that provides a food source, and even more so because of this connectivity with the river here. So you can see a large portion of the reserve boundary is flanked by the river, and in turn that does link to our biggest lakes. So they will outflow into it when they're too full, and in turn the river will flow into them when it's too full, so in flooding events. So yeah, the principle is very quickly you get colonization, and so very quickly that can provide a food source for larger creatures, really. Toads initially would colonize, an amphibian species that is terrestrial a lot of the time, but then will move into water bodies readily. But also your dabbling ducks that are very able to move around, and say are feeding on a lot of small invertebrates, sifting and obtaining food that way. So particularly in winter, we now see a great range of wildfowl species. So whereas in summer months, if you visit, you'll find sort of our regular species are well, there's the mallard and mute swan and gadwall, and then by the time we get into winter, we see greater numbers of widgeon and teal. So you've got teal up in the top picture there, shoveler, and then also occasionally we'll get a gargony or a scaup or a smew. And I suppose also goldeneye we get in good numbers because they use the river and the lakes. So these have all moved in because, as I say, the lakes can offer that food source. A lot of them will be migrating through, but they will stay. And so, as I say, there are good sightings, and certainly our birders all look out whenever there's windy days and things in winter. You're going to be expecting things to get blown in, and then to utilise the habitats that are there. In turn, I guess the lakes were then soon colonised by fish, whether by fish eggs on the feet of birds that had flown in, or by, say, flooding events. And that brings in some really nice species. So we get great crested grebe breeding on site each year. So yeah, they're beautiful to watch in terms of their breeding displays, and then their chicks riding on board backs of parents once they've hatched. Heron, grey heron, we don't have them breeding on site, but we have good numbers feeding here and then breeding not far away. And kingfisher, similarly, we get those in the reserve quite a lot feeding, but they need a good sandy bank to dig into to breed. So they actually breed just off the reserve on private land, but then come in and feed, you know, say nearby. So it's, you know, a really important food source for them, and interconnected with the surrounding habitat. On top of that, you can't make this out very well. It's a little bit hazy, the photo, but if you look closely, we see otter. Now these are more elusive. We do get otter otter occurrences quite regularly in the site because we find footprints, you know, so we have you know, wet margins and things of the lakes. You can keep an eye out and you do find footprints or scats. This is actually along the river just next to, you know, just flanking the boundary. Particularly when the river's high. So in winter, when river levels are high and fast flowing, we tend to get otters pop in because it's easier to get a meal. They're not battling against the river. And also, if they've bred locally and youngsters are displaced, then they tend to come in searching for a territory. So they're a really nice addition. And yeah, what I mentioned briefly earlier, toads are abundant. At times of year you will visit and be picking your way through the tiny toadlets that are just emerging en masse. So get a nice mild wet evening and yeah, suddenly the paths are hopping, and it's mostly with toads. We do have frogs as well. They tend to prefer the smaller water bodies, really. Toads have got both the adults and the tadpoles have got toxins in their skin, so they can withstand living in the big lakes where there's fish because they're not very palatable. So they do really well as a result. They've not really got major competition. So yeah, it's a win-win for them. I'll talk a little bit about other amphibians later, but to say primarily toads in relation to the lakes. Other things, dragonflies, damselflies. So these, distinguished by the dragonflies being much more robust and having their wings outspread, like this four-spotted chaser in the top left picture. The damselflies, by comparison, hold their wings sort of upright behind them. And additionally, although you can't tell from these photos, the damselflies have their eyes sort of on the sides of their head, not meeting, and the dragonflies have big eyes there that meet in the middle. They are in both the lakes and the ponds in the site, really. They need the margins, they need the marginal vegetation, but they are, well, their larval stage is aquatic, so they lay their eggs into the lakes or the ponds, and then the larvae will be in there for up to 2 years, for some of the species, going through different stages, different instars, we call it, and voracious predators. So even the larvae have a very big jaw, and as I say, they will munch through all sorts, really, other insects, other invertebrates. if you are out on the reserve and walking along, even just the public path between the visitor village and the lookout, for example, at the right time of year, so same sort of midsummer, you'll get great wafts of damselflies coming up out of the vegetation. So these are damsels that have emerged, you know, as fresh adults that summer with the warm water. So they've reached their final instar stage. They've climbed out of the water, metamorphed into the adult, and they're on the wing, finding food and finding mates. By comparison, the dragonflies tend to be actually territorial. You don't think of insects as having that kind of behavior necessarily, but you will tend to get a male patrolling up and down in a territory, actually fighting off other males. So you don't get great sort of drifts of them, because I say it's a different behavioral trait. So yes, we have, I think at latest count, I think it was 21 different dragonfly and damselfly species. As a visitor, you can't see them all because some are in our pools that are off limits simply to protect them, really. So yeah, they're just monitored a few times a year just to check what's going on in those pools, really. But the vast majority, yeah, are accessible because I say they're just patrolling up and down near lake edges, or say even just in grassy areas nearish the lakes. So yeah, that really has been a building picture with the lakes ever since day one, when they dug a big hole and it filled with water. So let nature take its course. It will, you know, bring the wildlife in, and obviously they're invaluable for a whole host of other wildlife as well, because it's all interconnected, you know. So anything from drinking water to also foraging habitat for example, Benton's bats. You don't think of bats immediately when you think of lakes, but yeah, they're reliant on big open water bodies over which they can hunt. And so we see them hunting over Meadow Lake, and they basically use their tail membrane to gaff insects off the water, so just flick them off the water to then catch them and eat them in flight. So that's specific to Benton's bats, and I say we definitely have those of an evening over our lakes. So moving on, a little bit more of what we had to start with. A lot of bare ground, really. So the quarry itself created a lot of bare ground, and then in turn us, the Wildlife Trust, coming in and reprofiling, I guess, created more bare ground. And it can seem visually quite hostile, but actually it's another invaluable habitat, really, because it enables plants and insects to move in. It's the early colonizers. Again, nature needs different stages. So so plants, orchids, they like grasslands, but they like sparse ground as well, where they can get in and not be outcompeted. There's a lot of risk with grasslands that they get too lush, and I say the likes of orchids just can't compete. So they've done well, and we have common spotted, we have marsh orchid, and we have bee orchid, all in places where the public can visit. So yeah, even just towards our play area and things, you can find all three species just walking from the car park towards the play area. Another species that came in, well, two, common wintergreen and round-leaved wintergreen are quite unusual in the county. And what we found is that they seem to be associated with patches of willow. So it's sort of sandy ground, and willow roots seem to do them very well. So we have huge patches of this notable species now, one of which is visible on the way to the visitor village, sort of from the car park. You're walking down the main drag to the visitor village, and there's little patches. So these glossy leaves in winter, and then quite distinctive little flowers. They're only a small plant, but yeah, notable. Bristly oxtongue, marsh woundwort. So these are all species that seem to have just thrived whenever we've disturbed ground, and they're basically getting a chance to germinate and get ahead before they get out competed by other plants. And marsh woundwort, for example, is a brilliant nectar source. So we get a little sea of marsh woundwort flowers once you've disturbed a little patch, and loads of hoverflies and butterflies and bees all feeding on it. So yeah, that's notable. Other things that like bare ground. Little ringed plover did really well in the early years at Brockholes because it was so disturbed. So part of the reprofiling was making islands, bigger islands than this, but it's an example in the bottom left of your screens. And really the key is that shingly, stony bare ground camouflages the birds, their eggs and their chicks really well. And they, yeah, do well in this kind of environment. Other wading species do too. So lapwing and oystercatcher and redshank are all inclined to favour patchy habitat, certainly, where there's wet ground that they can probe in for invertebrates, and where there's maybe some tussocks for them to shelter their chicks, and where, I say, there's enough bare ground and stone for them to camouflage. So in, was it 2014, I think we had 8 different species of breeding wader on our #1 pit island. So that's the biggest island on the reserve. And yeah, it was a roaring success, but nature takes its course, which is an interesting challenge for us, I suppose, and gives us a lot to weigh up, because as I said, plants move in, so bare ground doesn't stay bare, things seed, and so what was once bare is now very green, and eggs don't camouflage very well against green. And so breeding success has reduced and reduced over time. It's not without trying, I should add. We really have, we've fought hard, because it's a dilemma. You don't want to necessarily compete with nature. You want to allow nature to progress, but equally these are notable species that are struggling due to changes in land management nationally, really. So farming practice and things have potentially changed in terms of timings, and where bare ground of farmed fields is no longer available, then they're more reliant on perhaps nature reserves. So what's come in instead, really, obviously initially little plants, and then bigger plants, and then trees. So on our islands, we found that we were getting lots of rushes, so they're really tussocky and robust. So a little tussock here and there is good for a bit of shelter, but a big tussock is bad news because fox can hide behind it. And then as the soils got deeper, because plants shed their leaves in winter, for example, then we got tree seedlings in. So willow, birch, alder, they all have really light seeds. They are what we call early colonizing trees. So they blow for miles, set seed all over the place, and you have tons of willow. So we basically have been battling for a few years with mattocks and tree poppers, as here, to remove, that's the state of the island, to remove what you can see here, which is easily enough to conceal a fox and easily enough to put off a nesting bird. Our efforts have paid off. We've got it back to near bare in points, but then we've encountered other challenges. Basically, you discover that nature's quite clever, really, and it's sort of got it figured out, and that natural ecological succession will progress almost in spite of whatever you do. So we're honing efforts now into maybe smaller areas to really figure out exactly how to recreate these bare ground habitats. We've actually got to the point that we have got a digger of our own, just to tackle this kind of thing, because we've realised that with the best one in the world, us pulling at trees by hand isn't going to do the job enough. So that's really a battle ongoing. You will definitely see plenty of lapwing and oystercatcher and other wading birds in the reserve if you look out onto either of the big lakes where the islands are. But breeding success is a matter ongoing, and we're just figuring it as we go, really. We think the next thing is, well, we're starting to fence out the fox, basically, because again, it's a nature reserve. We want nature, but the fox does have plenty of other things to eat. So we are looking at fencing that out of some of the key areas.
It's probably worth asking a question that we've just had in, Lorna, from Helen, who's asked, do we have any plans for large grazers to do scrub bashing and create disturbed ground?
Yeah, good question. So what we do have cattle on the reserve, and they do a brilliant job of what we describe as poaching the ground. So they break up small amounts and make it muddy, which is good for invertebrates and things, but they just can't tackle the scrub element. So scrub being the seedlings and saplings of the willow and birch and alder. And they also, quite frankly, just don't like eating juncus. So juncus is the tussocky rush. So it's not very palatable. They will eat it, but not much. So we've trialed it, and we definitely will, we think our cattle are benefiting some of the habitat in some ways, but they alone are not the solution. And there's really pros and cons with most other species as well, in terms of, I suppose what we'd really need is more, well, we don't need more flood events, but flood events clean the island off and tend to, to wash things away. So perhaps in a bigger rewilding setting, you would be expecting to see shingles washed clear if a flood event occurred, but it would be quite devastating for everything else at the reserve if we were to be getting to that, side of things. So now, in answer, cattle have been our mainstay. They're longhorn cattle, and so they're heavy, and they do break up the ground really well, but they alone can't fix it. So that's why we've ended up with lots of man-made intervention, really. So yeah, heaps of willow, as you can see there. On the bright side, managing bare ground for insects, in particular mining bees and mining wasps, is actually quite a bit easier, because they're a bit less sensitive to so many factors as the ground nesting birds. So each year we manually, with spades and then also with the digger, take off sort of banks of vegetation to uncover bare ground again in sunny, south-facing zones, and it's really paid off. These areas need to be near nectar sources, so they need to be near, the wildflower meadows, which they are, and we've got several really, knowledgeable, keen naturalists monitoring who have found, I think it's 59 different species of mining bee alone. And then you've got sort of parasitic wasps and things. So it's a tricky ID area to get into, but if you do, it's very rewarding because you're finding new species all the time, really. So top left, you've got grey patched mining bee, and bottom right, you've got one of the nomad bees. I think it's the Lathbury's nomad bee, and the ecology is fascinating. So there are the different nomads, and they basically, they're a bit like a cuckoo, so they find the nesting burrows of other bees and lay their egg in the nest chamber, which then parasitizes and kills the host and then eats all its food. And they managed to time their emergence into adulthood exactly right to coincide with the host, and they've sort of, some have evolved to be, you know, very specific to just parasitizing one other species. And I say it's a bizarre and quite impressive sort of life cycle that they lead. And I say it's all enacted out on our mining bee banks. So you can just basically actually park and then just sort of stroll down to the visitor village, and there's all sorts of little holes along the way that you can check for activity. On a sunny day, they tend to be very busy, and what with, say, bees newly digging burrows and then others coming in to parasitize them. So yeah, that's been really insightful. You know, I'd come from not knowing much about insects, and there's just so much to learn. And just by creating bare ground and maintaining bare ground, we are actually, you know, encouraging a lot of species into the reserve, which is really positive. A nice book, actually. I've no reason to promote it except that it's of Lancashire, and so it does feature some of the species found on the reserve. So if you get into it, then you get really into it, and there's loads to learn. So yes, this is my bedtime reading to try and complement actually seeing things out on the reserve. So yeah, bare ground, an ongoing tale, definitely there at the start and now having to be manually created, but I say on different scales really, and small scale works really well. Large scale is tricky with tiny digger, but I say there's still a lot out there using it. Where next? Grassland. So when we took on the site, there was some land that hadn't been quarried, just I presume didn't have deposits that were good enough to merit digging the land up. So these were agricultural grassland, botanically poor, I'd say, mostly grass, different grasses and few wildflowers, but they had been left, so they'd been left unmanaged, which makes them go more tussocky, because I say you've not taken a crop off them, and resultantly, yeah, very good for small mammals and therefore birds of prey, because I say the small mammals could, you know, live amongst all the tussocks, birds of prey in turn could come and pick them off. And still today, there is a lot of unmanaged grassland in the reserve. Even just around the car parks area, there are swathes. So they're really good for small mammals and in turn really good for our birds of prey. So, you know, these were photographs, you know, all the photographs in here are taken on the reserve, and these, you know, were recent ones. And yeah, a success story really, but obviously feeding alone, well, it's supporting a species, but we wanted them to breed on the site as well. And we have a limit as to what they could breed in, so we just put up nest boxes, and that's worked really well. It requires a bit of upkeep, replace the boxes every so often, but it does mean that, to say, we have nesting pairs each year, bringing off chicks, you know, successfully. So yes, that's a success story all round really. These guys, so brown hare are also a success story related to grasslands really. They utilize both the mown meadows and the rough grasslands. The rough grasslands are good for getting, you know, hiding their leverets in when they're still very young. And so, as I said, even around the car park area, you'll find brown hare scampering around if you arrive early on a morning, particularly in sort of spring, you know, mad March hare season, so February, March time. Then they fairly disregard you really, they're more intent in their own activities. But yeah, other times of year too. We tend to have a leveret that gets born and lives in our polytunnel area each year, for example. Just drops one somewhere in amongst all the potted plants, and then yes, one day you turn on the hose and discover that there's a little leveret strolls out because it doesn't like getting a bit wet. So yeah, leverets, yeah, galore really, which is lovely. Obviously small mammals, like I mentioned, very reliant on grasslands, And then in turn, rarely seen except for amazing photos like this one, we definitely have stoat-and weasel on the reserve, because to say there are occasional sightings and then there are amazing sightings like this one. So yeah, they're just opportunising on everything else that's there, really. So yeah, grasslands of the rough and unmanaged kind offer that sort of aspect of, tussocky mammal habitat, but then also meadows. These were sown. So as you drive in on the right-hand side, the meadow flanking Meadow Lake, funnily enough, was sown specifically with native wildflowers, and a good mix that's now presenting a really colourful show each summer. And within it, there are these little yellow plant, so yellow rattle. That is, we call it a hemiparasite. So it hemiparasitizes grasses, so it reduces their vigour. So it's reliant on the grass, but it doesn't kill the grass, it just takes some of its nutrients. So that's really key, because I say a lot of meadows, the problem is if they have a lot of nutrients and if the grasses get very well established, they outcompete the wildflowers. Managing meadows as traditional hay meadows, the management practice is almost sort of gone now. So we're sort of trying to adopt that practice as best we can, really. It's a fine balance always. It's all about mowing at just the right time when the wildflower seeds have set and dropped, or about to drop, but say not too late in the season that the ground is too wet and you're going to churn it up, but late enough that the many insects using it have managed to breed. So they will not only feed on all these plants, for nectar and pollen, but they will lay eggs, which will then have the larvae, the caterpillars will need to eat the foliage of the plants themselves, pupate, and then usually the pupae will overwinter in the ground, ready to emerge the next summer. Again, butterflies are quite amazing, really. They all seem to have different life cycles. So some will pupate and overwinter as a pupae, some will instead hibernate as an adult, and then you even have some that overwinter as eggs. So yes, all different, but the principles are that, to say, the mowing is got to be critically timed. So we mow, and then, as you saw in one of those early pictures, we physically rake off the grass. Often the land is too uneven to bale it, really, and you also end up with it full of soil and bits and bobs. It's not like managing big swathes of meadow, really. It's quite little patches. So a lot of it's very physical, but the result is it's paying off. We've had even like 3 broods of common blue off in a year in our good years, which is very impressive. It means they're getting in early, taking lots of nectar, getting their eggs laid, and then I say there's 3 cycles happening in a year, which is basically because they've got a good food source combined with good weather. So yeah, I think that was grasslands. I guess, if you're visiting in the future, take a walk in the summer. If you go from the visitor village, you can see towards the lookout, either side of you, there's meadow areas. So these have some of the species that you saw back there. I don't know if I can go back. The bird's foot trefoils and the knapweeds, so the yellow and the purple there, are particularly good, and the red clover. Early, very early, so right now we've got the cuckoo flower that you can see in the top left. So yeah, come and explore. I say you'll find it heaving with invertebrates, butterflies and bees in the summer months. But reed beds are another thing that's a sort of synonymous with brockholes. So from the very early days, we did have reed beds in the very southern end of the meadow lake. But apart from that, it was just pits. So this was early days reed bed, lots of planting with all these little cages around them, because wildfowl love reeds, we established. Or rather reed seedlings. Young reed is obviously very palatable. And so you plant them and leave them, then they'll just get hoovered up. So I think lots of different methods were trialed early doors. If you go to Brockholes currently, you'll find, as you look across towards, from the access road towards the visitor village, there's some big wooden frames in the lake, and they have their reed cages, basically. So to cage wildlife out, to let the reeds grow. And it works. And so within quite a short space of time, really, you know, only a few years, 3, 4, 5 years, you'll get actual, you know, reed beds, reed fringes, I suppose, because they're all around the edges of the lake. And in turn, you've then got your habitat, and I say, so then you get your wildlife. So come in the next sort of, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks to Brockholes, and you'll hear a lot of song. So sedge and reed warblers chirruping away. This is a sedge, and they tend to be easier to photograph. They tend to come up a bit higher on the reeds. And so they'll be fighting away for territories, declaring territories, reed buntings as well. So they've all really taken to all the fringes around the lakes. And in turn, the reed is then seeded itself into places. So like some of the pools in our marshes have now become reed beds. And they are actually what now supports our starlings in winter. So some of you may have come and seen the Starling Murmurations. They tend to be best seen sort of early winter, maybe November time. And you get these wonderful aerial displays, but then they actually are gathering to then roost in reed bed. And they all just go down together. It's, again, they speculate as to what exactly the cause is, that they're gathering to share information, to share heat and energy, and obviously in terms of lesser risk of an individual getting predated. So early winter, they tend to come into our reed beds, and then they make a right mess and flatten them. They move to another patch and another patch, and then by late winter, they tend to have moved off and probably found a tree roost elsewhere. But yeah, so that's another aspect of the reed beds. And then winter also, we were pleasantly surprised to find that we are getting a wintering bittern or 2 each year. Now, bitterns have struggled. I mean, I think they went extinct in the 1800s in the UK, and then they've fluctuated throughout the 1900s in terms of numbers. Numbers have got critically low at some points because they're so sensitive and require vast swathes of reed bed, really, which is a tricky one. It has to be managed in such a way that you have lots of open water underneath it. We don't have that. We don't have the extent of reed bed to support them breeding, certainly not at present. We do have ideas for creating some bigger reed bed areas. But what we do have is plenty of food for them in winter. So we get individuals coming in and doing exactly the same, just living in the reed bed edges where they're camouflaged, and they can just plunge in and grab fish in amongst the reeds. So that's been really positive. And I say, although we haven't got them breeding, it is, you know, a really notable thing that to say we're offering habitat to a species that really was struggling at one point and is now sort of on the increase, but just needs that boost, really. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, listen out for sedge and reed warblers, and then come for a stroll through our hawthorn tunnel. So hedgerows, they were another thing that we adopted with the reserve. We had a few mature hedges, so the former farm hedges, really. And this one, as you can see, is along, well, it's along the gild wheel, and it's closed in at the top, so it's formed a nice tunnel, mostly hawthorn. And some were over mature, so we've managed them. So hedge laying, as you know, keeps the hedge alive. You cut it in such a way that it regenerates and it forms a denser vegetation in the base. So we've done a lot of that. And just to illustrate, yeah, I mean, they support loads of small perching species, song thrush, I don't know, chaffinch, blackbird, etc. In summer months for breeding. But to say in winter also, the hawthorn is a good draw for redwing and fieldfare. So in good berry years, you'll get them all along this tunnel that's in the back photograph there. And so, yeah, in recognition that hedgerows are valuable, we've also planted more. And gradually we'll look to manage those, bring them into rotational management. It's important not to manage them all harshly, sort of the same year. You need to make sure there's berries on, so trimming back doesn't allow for berries, so you do it on rotation. So the hedges are kind of booked in for rotational management, with the exception of this one, which we're just allowing to do its thing because it looks nice. What else? Hedges. Have I got any illustration? No. I was going to say, the main things as well, really, are that you think of birds, I think, with shrubs, but it's everything else that they support as well. So lots of insects, and also commuting and foraging corridors for our bats. So we definitely have common pipistrelle, soprano pipistrelle, whiskered and brants, commuting up and down the hedgerow corridors in the reserve. They use the woodlands as well, but the hedges are really good for offering that sheltered space, usually with loads of midges, just after dusk. So that's perfect for them. They can hoover up. And also, yeah, your small mammals, and even amphibians, you know, commuting corridors with hedgerows are really important. And on top of that, the fact that most of our hedges are next to bramble, really. So bramble in the front photo here is an important plant, the bane of our life sometimes, because I say it rips you to shreds when you're trying to do anything in a brambly area, but really important for this species. White letter hair streak. So the food plant for the larvae is the most critical, which is elm. And with Dutch elm disease wiping out so many large elm trees in the 80s, I think, this white letter hair streak butterfly as a result is very localized and rare. And we have a strong colony of them at Brockholes, associated specifically with our elm trees, surprisingly enough. So we have wych elm, and then next to that we have big thickets of bramble, which is perfect for the adults to then feed on. They're not very strong flyers, so they need to literally sort of flutter down from the tree to the bramble, feed, and then eventually they can flutter back up to the tree and lay their eggs. We've had some naturalists, one chap in particular, amazingly committed, has gone searching for the actual eggs and larvae. And if you can see here, there is camouflaged in amongst the bud. This is the leaf bud as it's all emerging early in spring. The sort of pink fluffy thing at the front is a tiny little caterpillar. So he first went searching for the eggs, found them, and then found the larvae as well. So we're trying to extend the range of this, say, weak flying butterfly by adding more elm and by allowing the bramble to form a corridor. And also, where am I? Oh, I've lost it. I was going to say I've got another bramble picture somewhere, but yes, we may stumble across it. Also, the bramble's really good for just nesting whitethroat, grasshopper warbler even. If it's next to water, does like a bit of scrubby bramble to get in amongst, and Chetty's warbler as well. So the warblers like to be near water, and they like reeds, but they do also like a bit of scrub to offer a bit more protection. So bramble scrub is the way forward in a lot of respects. Right, what was I doing with this one then? Woodlands. Woodlands was an uninspiring story at Brockholes to start with, really. We inherited lots of plantations, native species, but they were planted as visual and audio screening for the quarry, and therefore not really planted with wildlife in mind. There was quite a few blocks of single species. They were all the same age. They didn't offer much structure. And for quite a long time, we didn't really know what to do with them. And then, like it or not, we've had it thrust upon us that we have ash dieback, which is disease coming in, fungus-borne disease that is killing quite a few of our trees, ash, obviously. And so, to be honest, it's a little bit tragic, and we're hoping that, you know, nationally, a lot of the ash survive. But for us, it is an opportunity to diversify the woodlands, to restructure them a bit, and to have a lot of dead wood and just more features that wildlife can use, really, because young plantation woodlands didn't really offer enough. They offered food, but not really much shelter. Photo of a chiffchaff, just for interest, really. Other things you wouldn't think of as using a woodland, but are amphibians. Everything's interlinked. I guess that's something, you know, so you will find great crested newts, we think, have walked into the reserve through the woodland, basically. They didn't live here when the reserve started. There were surveys of the ponds, and yet they were up in ponds about 800 metres away from the top boundary, and they've basically trekked in through the woods. And they will live in the woods and eat slugs and things. So yes, sorry, I digress. Woodlands, we're enhancing them as best we can. They've had bat boxes in them, which is a poor picture to the right of your screens. As a dead wood heaps are invaluable, really, for hedgehog, for small mammals, for amphibians to get into. And then more recently, tree sparrow terraces and tawny owl boxes. We know we have tawny owls in the reserve, but they certainly can't nest in young woodlands because they need holes, you know, they need rotten big trees, which we can't yet offer. So we can fake it by putting up, you know, alternatives. And then lots of tree planting. So in areas that are naturally getting some regeneration of trees, we're kind of embracing that. And although we don't like having to use plastic on the reserve, we are operating under a sort of recycling scheme. So these Tubex tubes are quite brilliant for keeping the trees alive, to be honest. So it's just worth being aware. I say we would happily trial other materials, but they do need to be able to withstand deer and our beloved brown hare, which tend to strip the bark off the trees otherwise. So I say in nature, obviously the tree would shed many seeds and only a small proportion would survive. But if we're going to go to the effort of planting them individually, we kind of want them to survive. So hence the tree tubes, which we keep on them until they're big enough to be able to withstand some chewing or a deer scratching its antlers on them. So an example there of just inside the tube. It just offers them that protection whilst they get big enough, robust enough, so that they're not getting browsed. I mentioned deer, and if you visit, then you will more than likely, if you keep your eyes open, see deer. There's roe deer in the reserve, and they just tend to be secretively, you know, wandering around in the woods, but watching you. If you get your eye in, then you'll spot them. And then now and then they'll just more brazenly stroll across in front of you or your bike or whatever. So yeah, they're very tolerant now. They've become familiarized with seeing people at distance. They sort of know where people tend to be and where's safe. So yeah, you can get some really quite, you know, enjoyable experiences of seeing them. But they are, dare I say it, a bit of a pain when it comes to trees. So so this is the balance that has to be had. They're not allowed to eat the ones we've planted. And there's my bramble. Okay, slightly the wrong shot. Yeah, bramble, bane of our life, but brilliant at the same time. Good for whitethroat, good for grasshopper warbler. Okay, let's move on. Bare ground, so I mentioned early doors, bare ground good for a range of things. This is often the scene at quarries, where they're digging in, they create sort of big cliffs into which sand martins can nest. And it was the case at Brockholes originally. It was the case over the road at Lower Brockholes, but then whenever the quarry continues, it removes those nest features. Naturally, you also see it along the river. So the Ribble next to the reserve, you see banks where the river's eroded and opened up a habitat for the sand martins to use to burrow into. They make quite long burrows. They're sort of 60, 70 centimetres long into the bank. Now, we can't emulate that in the reserve. There's just not anywhere that you can get that height variation and have the confidence that it's not going to collapse. So instead, oh sorry, that's a sand martin. Instead, what we've done, I think this was 2013, was bring in fake, nest boxes. Much like we're putting up nest boxes in the woodlands, we put nesting boxes next to the lake. They're looking a little overgrown in this bottom picture because they need annual upkeep and clearing out and things. But basically, yeah, they work really well. Everyone is like a sort of shoebox chamber, well, a long pipe, and then a sort of shoebox behind it. And we clean them out and fill them with sand each year, and that works. They basically use the tube like their burrow, push through the sand, and then nest in the back of it. I don't think I have a picture. Yeah, so yeah, basically then we can go open the back, slide it open at the end of the season and clean them out, which is really good, especially because, say, they're not without predators as well. So we've put pigeon spikes along the tops of these to stop crows from then sitting on top and pecking in. But what we hadn't ever envisaged was something captured the other day. If any of you on our Facebook page, on the riverside, we had grey heron standing in front of the nest burrows, grabbing the sand martins as they came out. So that's why they do like a sort of quite a high bank. In lieu of that, these boxes either have a moat cleared out in front of them each year, or they also have a deflector at the bottom to try and keep them safe from predators. So yeah, that's what we're doing in terms of that. And then other little bits and bobs, really. There's open water and terns. So keep your eyes on our website in the coming weeks. We have a camera out on one of our rafts. It's not live at the minute because there's nothing happening, but the terns did land on it today. And then we've got another raft. This is one that we just made last week. And so basically, again, you're emulating stony ground with these little sort of shelters so that the chicks can get away from any predators and can get out the sun. And our first terns have arrived back. So they migrate in, and I say they're notoriously quite aggressive over their sites. So they will pick a nest site and then defend it really rigorously. So we try to provide, yeah, several nesting habitats. Ultimately, I want a little sort of archipelago of different rafts because they like to nest in a colony. But you would not believe how difficult it is to make rafts from scrap, which is what we always do. Everything is made from scrap because we don't ever have the money to do it properly. So yeah, just random bits and bobs, and we've got a few beautiful rafts to go out on the water this year. I think we're about getting there. Apart from that, basically, we're busy. Oh, there's our digger. I just threw a few in at the end. Ponds, this was to remind me about ponds. So yes, we had some ponds from early doors, but as ever, say, nature tends to get carried away and fill them with vegetation. So unless you keep on top of it, then you don't have a pond anymore. So now we have the digger. We're digging fresh ponds and we're also restoring ponds. Particularly now we know we've got great crested newts because they're, say, a protected species and yeah, very much in need of help. So they can now breed in the new ponds. And apart from that, just other bits and bobs. This is predator fence work. So this is out on the islands. So the right-hand picture is taking the power from the lookout right across the lake. So this was us trying to rig it, how to do that. And basically, it's an electric fence like you use for livestock, but with just more strands. So they're rigging it on the left-hand side there. And And the idea is that basically we just designate a specific area where fox can't go. It can eat anything else on the reserve, because anything else that's plentiful is fair game. That is nature. But the species that are struggling, we're just giving them a bit of a helping hand, a bit of protection for the few months whilst they are sat on the ground, you know, either brooding, incubating eggs or brooding chicks. I think that's it on that cheery note. So there's lots to see. It's all interlinked, and there's lots going on. What happened in the future? I think we're learning to find a balance between letting nature take its course and knowing when to intervene and when it's critical to do that bit more intensive management, and finding that balance is something that we are pretty much there with. I think we just had to learn where the site wanted to go, because I say a new nature reserve, which is what Brockholes has been, doesn't always sit or follow the design plan. You know, there was an original plan, but nature didn't know that, so it's finding its way, and we've got to find a way to maximize and to use that, really. So yeah, I think without further ado, I'll hand back to Victoria.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lorna.
Okay.
I'm like frantically thinking, what do I need to go to Brockholes for tomorrow now? Because I want a nice walk round.
Turn raft. Or maybe us trying to put the other turn raft out. We got very wet trying to sort out finishing off making it. We both ended up dunked this week. So yeah. We thought the guys in Focus would probably be laughing. We now have our In Focus based in the Lookout, so selling their optics, and we were kind of the other end of the lake, basically clouding around, getting soaked, with the full intent of doing a proper job, but it just didn't work. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I mean, wow, it's just fascinating to see the number of different habitats on that site, really, isn't it? And the sort of the different array of wildlife. And I just wondered if do you have a favourite spot on the reserve, Lorna?
Location. Yeah, there's a nice glade, and I'm not going to tell you where it is.
Oh, I knew you'd say that. You're going to keep it for yourself, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. It's one that technically I think the public could get to, so other people probably think it's their own glade as well, and I'm going to let people all think that. But yeah, you're sufficiently enclosed that you can just sit quietly and watch nature and sort of close everything else out. So yeah, I think that's it. Somewhere that you can just settle and absorb what's around you, really. And I say some of our meadows, and I say this bit of meadow that looks out onto the lake in particular. But I say I think any of the meadows in our summer months are nice to just sit and, I don't know, to settle and just listen and watch, really.
Yeah. What about you, Alice? What's your favourite spot on the reserve?
I really like the path from the visitor village up to the lookout. Like Lorna said, if you go sort of, I don't know, early summer, you can just walk down there and you can just see like flashes of really bright blue from the damselflies. I've only ever seen a dragonfly maybe once or twice in the 3 years I've been there, but I just love. Yeah, I love all Brockholes, but that path particularly, I really enjoy it.
Yeah, oh good. I fancy a walk to Boylton Wood. Are the bluebells out in Boylton Wood at the moment?
Yeah, the bluebells are putting on a lovely show now, and yeah, it's just it's lovely and tranquil in there, isn't it? Really?
Yeah,
very nice.
Lovely. I don't think we've missed any questions, have we, Alice?
No, just a lot of people saying thank you, really informative session, and a lot of people saying you've made me determined to go, and that I've not realised that I've been watching a quarry turn into a full reserve all these years. And yeah, I think for quite a lot of people, they might have just visited and you know, appreciated the reserve as it was and not known its history. So I found it very interesting, and I and I kind of knew bits, but definitely not that much.
Yes, wonderful, thank you. So we do have another Brockholes event, digital event, on the 12th of May, which will be on Zoom, and it is on our website, so you can take a look at that, see if you want to book onto that one. And we've got one about recording on iNaturalist, I think, in a couple of weeks. So we are keeping up with the digital events, even though we are hoping that we will be able to run some more face-to-face events and activities in the spring and summer. We do have our Mearsands Wood Nature Reserve as well over in Rufford, and we have been working on a visitor centre there, a new visitor centre. So keep your eyes on our social media and on our website, and hopefully we'll have some more information for that. I mean, the reserve is open as well for you to visit for that. So we will send out a link to this and just a bit more information about the trust for those of you that might not be so familiar with Brockholes, and for the Wildlife Trust, so information about how you might be able to become a member or donate or become a volunteer, and all those sorts of different opportunities that you can get involved with us, we shall let you know about. So I think I shall say thank you to everybody, and let everyone go off and enjoy their evenings.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.